Hey Waffle Gang, I do hope you're well. My name is Mark and today we're checking out some neighbor stories. And if you do love a Reddit story, why not consider hitting that like, subscribe, maybe that notification bell too, and let's crack on with today's first stories. Now I just want to say before we jump into it, these are neighbor stories. One of them was mailed into me, which I absolutely love to see. The other comes from our very own subreddit as well. The first one is a bit of UK-based drama, neighbours with a council and all that sort of stuff. The second one is an HOA drama, in trouble with mother-in-law, let me tell ya. Holy moly. Let's crack on with it. This one's from a user who just asked me to call them Bob. Love a Bob. And it's titled, My New Neighbour Turned Out to Be a Living Nightmare. Hey Mark, thanks for sharing your neighbour's story recently. Like yourself, I've had the occasional drama, but I wanted to mail you with a drama that happened to be around 4 years ago. I've been living in my cozy semi-detached house in a quiet neighbourhood in northern UK for about 5 years, which was council rented when my previous neighbour decided to move out. I was a bit apprehensive about who might move in next, but I tried to keep an open mind. When the new neighbour finally arrived, I made an effort to be friendly. We exchanged polite smiles and brief hellos when we saw each other outside, and I even brought over a plate of homemade scones as a welcoming gift. Classic, what do you call them, scones? At first glance, they seemed like a decent person, and I was hopeful that we'd have a cordial relationship. Little did I know, this was just the calm before the storm. I shouldn't get excited at someone else's drama, but I'm excited. It started with the music. Every night around 10 PM, my neighbor would blast their music at an ungodly volume. The walls would vibrate and the bass would rattle the windows. After 3 sleepless nights, I decided to confront them. I mustered up my courage and knocked on their door. When they answered, I politely said, "Hi, I'm sorry to bother you, but the music you're playing is really loud and it's keeping me up at night. Would you mind turning it down a bit?" My neighbor looked at me with a smirk, oh god, and replied, "Oh, come on, mate, it's not that loud. I'm just having a bit of a housewarming party, you know. Gotta celebrate my new place." I tried to reason with him and said, "I understand, but it's going on for several nights now and I have to work early in the morning. Could you please keep it down after, say, 11 PM? They rolled their eyes and said, "Fine. I'll try to keep it down, but no promises. You know how it is. Once the party gets going, it's hard to stop." I went back to my house hoping they would keep their word. But the next night, the music was just as loud, if not louder. I even left a note on their door the following day, politely reminding them of our conversation, but the music continued. I had to invest in earplugs just to get a decent night's sleep. It was clear that my neighbor had no intention of being considerate, and this was just the beginning of my nightmare living situation. After several more sleepless nights, I decided to contact the local council to file a noise complaint. I explained the situation to the environmental health officer who sympathized with my plight. They advised me to start keeping a detailed log of the noise disturbances, including dates, times, and descriptions of the noise. "It's important to gather evidence," the officer explained. "Recording the noise using your phone or a sound recorder. The more information you can provide, the stronger your case will be." I followed their advice and started recording the nightly disturbances. It was a tedious process, but I knew it was necessary. After 2 weeks of diligent record keeping, I submitted my evidence to the council. The environmental health officer reviewed my case and informed me that they would be sending a warning letter to my neighbor. "This is the first step," they said, "and if the noise continues, we'll escalate the matter and potentially issue a noise abatement notice." I was relieved that action was being taken, but I knew the process would take time. The council had to follow a specific procedure, which included giving my neighbor opportunities to rectify their behavior. Weeks turned into months, and while the noise did subside somewhat after the warning letter, it never entirely stopped. I continued to log the disturbances and maintain communication with the council. The environmental health officer assured me that they were building a strong case, but it was a slow process. In the meantime, I had to endure countless sleepless nights and the stress of living next to an inconsiderate neighbor. I started to feel trapped in my own home, dreading the evenings when the music would inevitably start blasting. The council eventually issued a noise abatement notice, but even then, my neighbors seemed to find ways to skirt the rules. They would play loud music during the day when they knew I was at work. or they would have their friends over for acoustic jam sessions that were just as disruptive. Living with this ongoing noise nightmare was taking its toll on my mental health and well-being. I began to question whether I had the patience to see the council's process through to the end. I started considering my options, wondering if moving to a new home would be the only way to escape this living hell. As if the noise wasn't enough, my neighbour started parking their car on my driveway without permission. I came home from work one evening to find their beat-up old Ford blocking my access. I knocked their door and politely explained that they couldn't park there as it was my private property. They apologised half-heartedly and moved the car, but it kept happening every few days. I contacted the council again and they advised me to put up no parking signs and to document the occurrences with photos. I followed their advice, but my neighbour seemed to ignore the signs completely. To make matters worse, my neighbour developed a new habit of burning fires in their back garden almost every other day. At first I thought nothing of it, after all, who doesn't enjoy a nice backyard fire on a summer evening? However, I soon realised they weren't burning normal logs. The smoke that billowed out over the fence was thick, black and acrid. It smelled like they were burning plastic or rubber. I couldn't open my windows during the summer months without my house filling up with the noxious fumes. I tried talking to my neighbour about it, but they brushed me off, claiming that they were just burning some old furniture and that the smoke wasn't a big deal. Once again, I found myself contacting the council. The environmental health officer came out to assess the situation and informed me that burning certain materials like treated wood or plastics was illegal. They assured me that they would address the issue with my neighbour. However, just like the noise complaint, the process was slow. The council had to gather evidence, issue warnings, and follow a specific procedure. In the meantime, I had to endure the foul-smelling smoke and the health concerns that came with it. Living next to this inconsiderate neighbour was becoming a nightmare on multiple fronts. Between the loud music, the parking disputes, and the toxic backyard fires, I felt like I was constantly under siege in my own home. The stress and frustration were taking a toll on my quality of life, and I began to wonder if I would ever find relief from this ongoing battle. I know I must sound like a bit of a grass at this point, running to the council at any chance I could, but I was really at my wit's end. This was a daily occurrence of some kind of drama. I came home from work one evening to find my neighbour waiting for me on the front lawn. Now, this isn't verbatim as it happened some time ago, but they said, "Oi, I've been meaning to have a chat with you." "What's this about?" I asked, already knowing the answer. And I can remember the grin that was on their face, which really pissed me off. "I know you've been reporting me to the council. I've got friends down there, you know." To which OP replied, "I wouldn't have to report you if you'd just been a considerate neighbour." They laughed. "Oh, grow up. A bit of noise and smoke. Stop being a princess. It could be so much worse. You should live where I just came from, but hey, you go run into the council like a good little grass." I couldn't believe it. My neighbour was getting a kick out of making my life miserable. "This isn't a game," I said. "This is my home, my life, and you're making it a living hell." And I remember feeling like I was going to cry at this point as I just felt so helpless. They said, "Well, if that's the path you want to go down, be my guest, but just remember, I know the process. I know how the council work. At this point, you're making your own life hell over a bit of noise and smoke." They walked back into their house, leaving me standing there, trembling with a mixture of rage and fear. I knew I couldn't back down, but I also realized I must have underestimated how twisted my neighbor truly was. I documented the confrontation and reported it to the council, along with the ongoing issues. I also started looking into legal options, like filing for a restraining order. I'm not sure I'd be able to get one at this point. It was just a verbal confrontation. After the confrontation, things took a turn for the worse. The noise, which had been mostly confined to the evenings, started happening at random times throughout the day. I'd be working from home and suddenly the wall started vibrating with a bass. It was like they knew exactly when I was on an important call or trying to concentrate. And every once in a while I'd wake up to find my bins turned over with rubbish strewn all over the front lawn. The first time it happened, I thought it might have been an accident or the wind, but when it kept happening, I knew it was my neighbor. They started sitting out front with their friends, laughing and shouting whenever I'd leave or come back to the house. It felt like I was running a gauntlet every time I had to walk past them. They'd make snide comments just loud enough for me to hear. Things like, "There goes the grass," or "Watch out, he might call the council on you. I tried my best to ignore them, but it was getting harder and harder to brush off their behavior. I felt like a prisoner in my own home, always on edge, wondering what they'd do next. I kept reporting the incidents to the council, but it felt like I was screaming into the void. The officer would come out, take my statements, and promise to look into it, but nothing seemed to change. I started to feel like I was losing my mind. I couldn't sleep, I couldn't focus at work, and I was constantly looking over my shoulder. I knew I needed to do something more drastic, but I wasn't sure what. That's when I decided to install cameras at certain points of my property. This peed me off, as they were expensive, but if my neighbor was going to play these games, I was going to have proof. I also started keeping a detailed log of every incident, no matter how small. It was a battle of attrition, and I was determined to win. I knew my neighbor was trying to wear me down, to make me give up, but I refused to let them win. I was going to fight back, even if it meant documenting every single transgression and pushing the council to take more decisive action. After months of documenting every incident and constantly pushing the council to take action, I finally received some good news. The environmental health officer called me one afternoon and informed me that they'd reviewed all the evidence I'd provided, including the footage from my security cameras and the detailed logs I had kept. They claimed they had seen enough. We're issuing your neighbor a formal warning. If they continue to engage in this behavior, they face more severe consequences, potentially eviction. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but at the same time I wasn't sure if I believed it. Finally, it seemed like my efforts were paying off. A few days later, I noticed a change in my neighbor's behavior. The music was quieter, the rubbish stayed in the bins, and they no longer loitered outside the front of the houses with their friends. It seemed like the council's warnings had done the trick, but I knew better than to let my guard down. I'd learned the hard way that my neighbor was unpredictable and vindictive. I continued to keep my security cameras running and my log up to date just in case. Weeks passed and the peace held. I started to feel like I could breathe again, like I could finally enjoy my home without the constant fear and anxiety. I even started to entertain the idea of inviting friends over, something I hadn't done in months. But just as I started to relax, I woke up one morning to find my front door covered in raw egg, with two of the shells just sat at the bottom of the windowsill. My heart sank, as I thought things were going back to normal. I did look at the footage, which was somewhat comical. She did disguise herself with black joggers and a hoodie, so you couldn't see any part of her, apart from the fucking bright pink fluffy slippers she seemed to have on constantly. I called the council immediately and filed a report. The environmental health officer assured me that they would take swift action, but I couldn't shake the feeling that nothing was going to happen once again. I knew that this was far from over. My neighbor had shown their true colors, and I realized I might be in for the fight of my life. I was determined to see it through, no matter how long it took or how ugly it got. I was going to stand my ground and fight for my right to live in peace, even if it meant going to war with a neighbor from hell. Just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, I received a call from the council officer. They said, "We've had multiple complaints about your neighbor from other residents in the area. Apparently they've been causing problems for everyone, not just you." I was stunned. I'd been so focused on my own battle that I hadn't even considered the possibility that my neighbor was terrorizing others as well. The officer informed me that they were launching a full investigation and that the neighbor could be facing some serious consequences. Apparently someone else got egged that evening and phoned that very morning. A few days later, I heard a commotion outside. I looked out my window to see a council van parked in front of my neighbor's house. Two council employees, I don't know what they were knocking on the door. I could hear my neighbor's muffled voice growing louder and angrier. Suddenly, the door flew open and my neighbor burst out shouting expletives at the officers. "You can't do this to me," they screamed. "I know my rights and you can't just show up here and harass me." The behavior was so bizarre. The officers remained calm, explaining that they were following up on multiple complaints and that the neighbor needed to cooperate with their investigation. But my neighbor was having none of it. They continued to rant and rave again. It was so loud she was practically screaming. I watched from my window feeling a mix of satisfaction and pity. On one hand, it was gratifying to see my neighbor finally facing some consequences for their actions. On the other hand, I couldn't help but wonder what had driven them to behave so badly in the first place. As the officers continued to talk to my neighbor, I saw other residents peeking out from behind their curtains. Oh, it's bringing me back. No doubt relieved that someone was finally taking action. 3 days later, she was just moving all of her stuff out again. I assumed being transferred to another estate. Part of me wanted to go out and smirk at her, but I'd just potentially be inviting more trouble. Another part of me felt sorry for the poor bugger who was going to have to deal with her next. I had learned the importance of standing up for myself, of documenting everything, and of never giving up, even when things seemed hopeless. It took a long time to get through this, and it was stressful. I'm sure some people would have dealt with her in a swifter manner. But I just can't, and I'm thankful it was dealt with in the end. My neighbors were apparently the same and had been suffering in silence, just like me. And it was only when we all spoke up that things finally changed. However, the day she was moving out, many other curtain twitchers like myself had a little grin at one another, and we eventually had a chat in our gardens and remained friends to this day. The day she left, I remember sitting in my garden, enjoying the peaceful sounds of birds chirping and leaves rustling. I couldn't help but smile. I'd faced down the neighbor from hell and come out stronger on the other side, and the brew and biscuit tasted that much better. Ooh, custard cream and a brew after drama. Gotta love it. And in that story, when the neighbor said that they know how the council works and they know how to manipulate the system and various benefits, etc., I knew families just like that and would cause various bits of drama and would use that to their advantage, manipulating the council system. And some of these people genuinely did get a kick out of being able to do this. It was enjoyable for them. I'm not saying it's the case in this particular one, but it certainly felt like it when I was reading it. It was bringing me back big time. But wowzers, trousers, thank you so much for sharing your story. We got another one on our own subreddit from r/MarkNarrations from Ginger Inside 007, who says, HOA president stalked me for weeks. My now ex mother-in-law ripped into him and it ruined his life. Woo-hoo-wee. Here we go. Hi Mark, I know how much you love HOA stories. I love it that people know this now. I figured I'd share this one. It's from about 2 decades ago. At the time, I'd moved in with my now ex-husband, boyfriend, and his mum when I was in college. Was 18 to 19 at the time. Ex-mother-in-law owned the house before it got grandfathered into a 55 plus community. So that rule didn't apply to her and many on the block. My boyfriend at the time was 4 years older and lived there the majority of his life. So it's probably been about 6+ months since I moved in. My mum left the state and I stayed for college where my ex and I met, so worked out. Also was legal to live there even with 55 plus rules, if applicable, but weren't. And I would drive home from school and work, getting home around 5ish in the evening. Boyfriend didn't get home until 6. Mother-in-law varied since she worked further and also was social, being out late. I started to notice this car following me home every day after some time. The guy would follow me and stop a few houses down and watch me go inside. This happened for about a week. Weird. So, second week, I would come through in another direction, and he figured a spot to sit and wait to see which way I came home. Every single day following me there. I told boyfriend and mother-in-law about it. They would watch for the car and, ironically, the guy lived down the way, like across the street, but in our view from home. I took notes and got his license plate and all. I had no idea who this dude was. It was freaky. One day he decided to park behind me in the driveway. Nobody else home. I called mother-in-law since boyfriend couldn't have phone at work and told her the guy is parked behind me. Couldn't get out and was sitting in the car. I got out, walked up and asked the guy why he's been following me because it was obvious. He asked me my age. I refused to answer. He asked if I legally lived there. I did and refused to answer. He asked if I knew the rules of the community. Yes, I sure as hell did. I asked mother-in-law about her homestead status and all before I moved in. Completely legal. I told the guy if he followed me again, I will call the police. Sure enough, followed me again. Parked behind me, blocking me in. I called the police, but they took forever and a day, so I told him to forget it. Mother-in-law started to get pissed off. I showed her where his car was once she got home one evening. Apparently he parked in another home's driveway next door to his house as the homeowner didn't have a car. Mother-in-law knocks on that door. Freaks out the lady as she pointed over to next door. The man following me comes out and starts asking why she's knocking on his neighbor's door. Well, I don't know, maybe because you're stalking and scaring my daughter-in-law, coming home from work every day and interrogating her for no reason. Oh, you're the HOA president. I remember you during one of the meetings. What gives you the right to stalk her to her home every day? The HOA president responds, she isn't over 18 years old and you need one person 55 plus and the people living there need to be over 18. She responds, she's 19 years old and for your information, if you looked at your ledger, I'm grandfathered into this place as I bought this house before you HOA dumbasses decided to take over. Now tell me, why are you stalking my daughter-in-law without reason? He replied, she isn't a valid resident to live, and mother-in-law cuts him off and says, excuse me? Say that again? And he went, she is not a valid resident. Mother-in-law says, you should look at your HOA laws and also about how half the neighbors have been grandfathered in. Why aren't you stalking the boy down the road that plays with his RC cars? Why aren't you asking why the other resident is subletting to people on the other side of my house? I should mention she's a realtor and I used to help her on her business. He replies, well, you don't need to provide proper documents to the HOA for anyone. And mother-in-law says, I do not have to provide you with any documents about my home as you are not my landlord. Nor does your HOA have the legality to tell me who lives in my house. Did you forget your own rules? And then this went on for a good half an hour. The mother-in-law told me to look into the guy as she got his details. I happened to have at the time ways to find things out on people and backgrounds. I will find you. Needless to say, after my investigative work, the guy was ousted, charged, arrested, and paid fines for taking money at the last place he lived being HOA president. I also found out 2 others on the board, including the treasurer and president, were taking money from the current HOA for themselves. They all moved after all this came out. A whole new committee was put in place. I was finally able to attend the monthly bacon breakfast at the clubhouse around the corner since I was a resident. I also got a restraining order on him. Mother-in-law pushed that one, and all the neighbors came out of the woodwork and started spilling their stories about the guy. How he fined people for menial things, harassed for extra HOA fees for an extra vehicle. All sorts of stuff. No idea where he went, but it was tainted on his record as mother-in-law had other places she worked with that were 55 plus, and made sure he could never be on a board again. It was quite crazy to see his charges from the previous HOA, and how this one decided to elect him as president. Huge red flag. Watching her get at him in the late evening hours for about half an hour was nice to watch. So many neighbors applauded her for that. I hate HOAs, lol. Come on, Ginger, you spicy so-and-so. You know I do love a good bit of HOA drama. I'm sorry you had to go through that, and the stalking must have been absolutely fucking terrifying. Someone just following you around when you're returning from work, parking behind you. That is crazy ass behavior. But holy moly, mother-in-law has taken no prisoners, isn't it? It's always nice when you read about a mother-in-law that takes no shit and comes in swinging. I love it. Why am I punching? Why am I air punching right now? My word, thank you so much once again for sharing your stories. And don't forget, if you do want to share your neighbor stories or any story in general, really, we're pretty open. We don't mind a story here. A little bit of dramatic story, you know me. Don't forget, you can share your story at r/MarkNarrations. Try to make it inclusive as possible, though. Always helps out. And just a huge thank you from the bottom of my heart for joining us today. Bit of neighbor drama. Love to see it every once in a while, right? You know me, I do love it. And I will see you in the next one. Take care and much love.